You smiling?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Why are you smiling?
I just really like smiling, sir. I'm so sorry. I like smiling. Please stop yelling at me. I like smiling. Smiling's my favorite. Hey, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Cinema Psych podcast. Podcast where psychology meets film. I am your host, Dr. Alex Swan, as always. And today we have I think, a really good movie. It's got its problems, and maybe we'll talk about some of those today. But today's film that we're going to chat about is 2000's classic Remember the Titans. The film based on a true story about an integrated high school football team. You know the main character. His face is all over the poster. That's right, Denzel Washington. One of the roles I think a lot of people think about when you say the name Denzel Washington. It wasn't the movie that he won his Best Actor Oscar for, but a great performance nevertheless. And historically, the real Herman Boone character that he plays was far meaner. And to take a really mean person and make them likable and charismatic, pretty much only something that I think, at least, Denzel Washington can do. Other names that appeared in this movie as, like really early teen actors that sort of had careers right after this. So Donald Faison it plays P.D. Jones, and he goes on to Scrubs fame and a lot more than there. Hayden Panettiere in one of her kid acting roles. Of course, we all know that she becomes a cheerleader in Heroes. Kate Bosworth plays a really racist former girlfriend of Gary Bertier. Ethan Suplee, who looks far different these days than he does as Louis Lastic, the everyman, I guess, that sort of doesn't matter if you're black or white. And so, yeah, he's the Michael Jackson character in this movie. And then my favorite, where are they now, people? Ryan Gosling. And I completely forgot that he was in this movie, and he played such the character he did. Somebody who only knows how to line dance or whatever the dance he's doing and only knows things about country music, but sure wants to know more about that Motown. Love his character. Love his character. A couple of other names that you might be familiar with. Will Patton plays Bill Yost, the coach, the white coach of this now integrated high school football team, or integrated high school, and it has a football team, of course. Directed by Boaz Yakin. I hope I'm saying that right. I don't think I've ever heard it said out loud by somebody else. And written by Gregory Allen Howard. That was like the second take of me getting that name right. So directed by Boaz Yakin and written by Gregory Allen Howard. And like I said, this film is based on a true story. So Disney, as the distributor and the production company, really did their Disney self on this one. So we are going to have a really good discussion on this one. So without any more delay, let's get right to it. My guest host today is friend of the show, Dr. Wynn Goodfriend. She's a professor, if you remember, of psychology at Buena Vista University in Iowa. This is her 5th appearance on the show. I think I need to get a 5 Timers Club jacket going. Wind, welcome back to the show. How are things going since we last spoke?
Things are really good for me. I'm super excited to be joining the 5 Timers Club here. I'm right up there with Steve Martin, right?
Yeah. Well, I'll get him on the line, and then I'll call Tom Hanks over. Oh, Paul Rudd just joined too. So yeah,
I'm in good company.
We'll get it. Yeah, we'll get everyone, getting everyone in and get your jacket, your golden jacket.
It's exciting.
It's in the mail.
Thanks.
Welcome. Welcome back. So last time you were on, it was the start of last spring semester. So it's been a year. So you've gotten up to a lot of stuff. But the last time you were on, as is the nature of this podcast, you were teaching a psych and film class. And it is one of the favorite ones of this show. So how did it go last year?
So I get to teach that class every other spring. I'm not teaching it right now, but I love teaching that class, partially because I get to watch movies and talk about psychology in movies, just like we're doing right now. And also partially because the students love it so much. But I'm always sort of surprised at the movies that they hate versus the movies they love, because they're usually the opposite of my opinion. So on this show, we have talked about 2 of my favorite movies, actually 3 of my favorite movies. You've talked about Memento. Together, we've talked about A Clockwork Orange and Rocky Horror Picture Show. They hate those movies. So and I, of course, love those movies. Today, we're doing the opposite and talking about a movie that is by far their favorite of the whole semester. And I like this movie.
Wow.
I don't love it as much as they do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We'll get into those thoughts in just a second, but I wanted to get your overall thoughts on choosing this film, both in your class and the one that we're going to talk about now. So, Remember the Titans came out in 2000, so over 20 years ago. It's old enough to drink in the United States, and we've been actually talking about doing this movie for a couple of years now. But I asked you a couple of weeks ago if you were down to do it now, and it being February, I think this is a pretty good movie to talk about race, being Black History Month. It's a good film to start that conversation, though, as we'll talk, it's not the strongest in that conversation. So what brings you to use Remember the Titans in this class?
I like to use Remember the Titans in this class because most of the students at my university are athletes, and so they enjoy the fact that we're sort of featuring sports. I also use this movie as the very last one in the semester. And I do that on purpose because so many of the movies we watch have very depressing topics. So we talk about suicide, we talk about clinical depression, we talk about sort of gender norms and sexual assault. And I like to end the semester with something that's a little bit peppier, just so that we feel good as we leave the semester. And as I said, my students not only love the movie, but it's a very sort of feel-good, very Disney movie.
Oh, yes, it is a Disney movie. Yeah, so I get that. Uplifting, the feel good. You sort of have it's got a great ending to it, very inspiring ending, which is successful for 2 reasons. 1, it's a Disney movie, and 2, Denzel Washington.
He's very symmetrical.
Oh my God, he is so good in this movie. He is the only thing that keeps me coming back to this one. And it's not even the one that he won his Best Actor Oscar for.
Oh, no. He's one of my favorites. I kind of have a little bit of a crush on Denzel.
Me too.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he's fantastic. Great acting. I'm curious if I had a conversation with him, kind of what he would think about this movie looking back on it 20 years ago, but he was great in the film.
Yeah, and I gotta say, everyone else was. The football is passing. not intended, but really good. Nevertheless, so it's not well filmed because they're not really playing football, but it is, I suppose, mediocre is what I'll call it. So what I want to start our discussion with an exploration of the major themes of this film before we get into the site content. The major themes of this film as a window of the past, but also a way to use it in the future, so to speak. And that is a film about segregation, race, specifically white and black individuals in a southern town right after integration. So it says in the movie. We'll talk about the inaccuracies historically later in the program. So I want to get your gauge on the major theme of the film, thinking on it now.
Well, I think the major theme of the film is overcoming prejudice and seeing how we're all in this together. I think that's sort of the obvious message. I think it's what the producers intended. And, for a Disney movie, they do deliver on that message.
Sure. Do you have any reservations on the message now versus back in the message being received back in 2000?
I think my major reservation with it when I watch it now is it's Disney. What I mean by that is it's such a simplified version of reality. It's nothing particularly hard to watch. It's not tragic. People aren't dying, and that is the reality of the world today. So it's the sort of Disney-esque, appropriate for 7th grade kind of version of what's going on in reality.
Yeah, I like that last, appropriate for 7th grade. So I'll be honest, I haven't watched it. I rewatched it for our conversation, but I hadn't watched it in probably more than a decade. But I've seen it about 3 or 4 times, probably within that kind of, oh, this is on, oh, I'll give it a watch because I like Denzel kind of vibe. But I don't think I ever really paid as close attention to the way that the integration of these schools and the closeness to the Sharif Robbers Cave study that I would have. I didn't then, but I do now. And I'm just like, yeah, this, and you put it perfectly. It's Disney-fied, and they make it in a way that I think sidesteps the actual issues. And so I think if I were to use this film as a teaching tool, I think it would have to come with a disclaimer like, listen, this movie is going to show you a rosy picture of racial relations in 1971 that don't appear to be the case even in 2020X, whatever the year is, right?
Right.
So keep that in mind. You are watching a Disney movie.
Right. I think that's a really important point. And I think later tonight we're going to kind of talk about reality versus fiction in this actual story. So we can kind of come back to this theme, but it's definitely, the world's happiest integration, just like Disneyland.
Yeah, right, because Ruby Bridges was getting rocks thrown at her.
Right.
So, and granted, that was, in the 1950s when schools first started getting integrated in the South, and this film is set in 1971, you would think it would be rosier, but it was still pretty tough.
And I think that,
and in most places.
Right. I mean, one of the things that we have to acknowledge is that it takes place in Alexandria, Virginia, which is a pretty cosmopolitan place and was pretty okay with integration, relatively speaking, to a lot of other places in the country. So the fact that they have like this protest on the first day of school, that just didn't happen. So, again, I think it's important for us to kind of come back to this at the end.
Yeah. Okay. So we got our thoughts out there. It's not the end all be all racial. It's not the beginning nor the end of a racial discussion that anybody should have. So I think getting that out right in front before we talk about the psych stuff was important. Speaking of the psych stuff, though, there are a lot of parallels, like I said, to some research that we have seen in social psychology over the last 70 years, we'll say. And it first starts with Gordon Allport. So what did Gordon Allport say about groups coming together?
Yeah, so he's a really well-known name in early social psychology, and he wrote the first textbook on prejudice in the United States. And at the time that he was doing research, 1940s, 50s, the idea at the time, the prevailing hypothesis in psychology was if you wanted to end prejudice against two groups, what you should try is what was called the contact hypothesis. So the contact hypothesis at the time was the idea that you maintain prejudice against the out group, whatever group you're not in, because you don't hang out with them. You don't spend time with them. And so you have nothing to go on except for the stereotype that maybe your culture has taught you. And if you just spent time with them, that contact, then your prejudices would go away and you would, see the beautiful rainbow diversity in the other group.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Allport basically said it's not that simple. So he...
Right.
I mean, which we know, right? Like a lot of times when you interact with somebody from an out group, you walk away from that confirming your prejudice. Or if it's a negative interaction, it can get worse.
Mm-hmm.
So Allport kind of acknowledged that, and he set out 4 criteria that he believed would be important for the kind of contact that would actually be successful in reducing prejudice. And the big famous study that tested that kind of in real life was by another person called Muzafer Sharif, who was an immigrant from Turkey. And he did the famous study that we call Robbers Cave.
Yeah, Robbers Cave State Park.
Right.
Is where that is. You can go visit there if you want to. So let's take these 4 criteria in turn and see if we can place them in some scenes in the movie to give context to the listeners. So what's the first criterion?
So what Allport hypothesized and what Sharif kind of tested was that in order for the prejudice to be reduced, you had to have interaction or contact where both groups started with equal status. So if one group has sort of privilege over the other group, that's just going to build resentment. It's going to build, maintaining the status quo of one group having more power over the other. In the movie, Remember the Titans, how we see this kind of play out is that the players are concerned about, am I going to get a starting position, right?
Right.
And so they're both kind of used to having a starting position from their segregated schools. And what they're told is you will get a position based on your actual talent and effort and attitude. And so how that plays out in the movie, again, because it's a Disney movie and everything is perfect, is that then kind of puts everyone on a level playing field, literally and figuratively.
Right. Love it.
And that works out really well. Everyone starts the same.
If you survive camp, you will be on the team.
Yeah, and I think a good thing to add here is as the players start the same, so do the 2 coaches. So Bill Yost is the head coach of this high school as it existed as a white high school, and then with the integration of black students of another high school, I think it was, in the area into a singular high school.
Yeah, it was 3 separate high schools, actually.
3 separate high schools.
They don't even mention that in the movie, but in reality, it was 3 separate high schools.
It was, okay. And so then we have this new coach coming along, not affiliated with the other high schools that were integrated, but from I think it was North Carolina. So he comes from a high school coaching job there, and he was the head coach there. So they're both head coaches. And when they come, it's almost like Herman Boone is going to be the assistant coach to Bill Yost, but the school board, I think it was, had other plans, and they did plan to make Boone the head coach, but wanted him there first.
Right, and so that does.
So
kind
we've
of
got two equals.
I mean, they're almost equal, but in fact, like Boone is the head coach, right? So I'm
just talking about the moment that they arrive together, where they don't really know what's gonna go. But they do want to run the program in their own ways,
right? And they each have their own thing that they're in charge of, right? Like one person, I don't know.
One sports, gets offense, one gets
offense,
defense.
I don't want to use the wrong sports words, but it seems like they have their own kind of compartmentalized thing that they're in charge of. And it's true that one is the head coach and one is an assistant coach, but they do seem to have like their own responsibilities, which is helpful.
Yeah. And I think that as the movie wears on, even though Yost is in charge of the offense and Boone is in charge of the defense, but Boone is also, he's like, if your offense start messing up, then I'm taking over or whatever. I think as the film goes on and they start sort of montaging through the games that they keep winning because they're so good, that I think that power struggle there kind of dissipates, and they crosstalk on what would be good for offense, what would be good for defense. I mean, we see it a little bit toward the beginning when they're at camp, and Yost hands, or vice versa. I don't remember who hands who what.
Boone hands Yost the playbook.
Oh, a playbook. Like, give these a shot. These worked for me, kind of thing. Yeah. So, a lot of...
Oh, no, sorry. The scene you're thinking of, it was the other way around. Yost gives Boone the playbook and says, like, this is my trick plays. And Boone's like, I don't do trick plays.
Yeah, I don't do trick plays. You have to do trick plays.
Well, and he ends up doing a trick play later in the movie.
Right. No dialogue is wasted here. So, yes. Okay, so what is the second criterion?
The second criterion is that the individual people within the two separate groups have to spend time with individual people from the other group and more than one person from the other group. And the idea there is, if you just spend time with one person from the other group and you learn something about that person, you might then say, oh, everybody from that group is like this one person. But that maintains your stereotype, right?
Right.
So if I find out Alex really likes dogs, then I might think like everybody from Alex's group really likes dogs. So the idea is, if you spend individual time with various people from the other group, you learn to see the diversity within the out group. And that makes you realize my stereotype doesn't hold up, because there is diversity in that group just as much as there is diversity in my own group.
Mm-hmm. And I think you hit the nail on the head there with you can't just do it with one person. You got to do it with multiple people. And so how do they achieve this in the movie then?
Right. So this is a big part of the movie where they're going to the camp sort of to get ready for the school year. So it's
hitting on Robbers Cave, like right on the nose with the camp thing.
Right.
Yeah.
So for people who aren't familiar with Robbers Cave, Sharif sets up this summer camp where boys actually come to the summer camp. They're separated. And then they create Prejudice sort of experimentally by putting them through a series of sports tournaments where they decide that they don't like the other group. Okay, so now we have to get them to like each other.
Right.
So in the movie, he does this by, first of all, getting everybody off the bus and making them sit with a player from the opposite race.
All right, listen up. I want everybody off the bus. Let's go. Follow me, everybody. Let's go right now. All right. Everybody off the bus. Listen up. I don't care if you're black, green, blue, white, or orange. I want all of my defensive players on this side, all players going out for offense over here. Right now. Let's move. Let's move. Let's move. Let's move. You and you, offensive bus, sit together. You and you, defensive bus, sit together. Get comfortable, too. Because the person that I have you sitting next to is the same one that you'll be rooming with for the duration of this camp.
And that actually happened in the real Remember the Titans. So that scene is true to life. Then when they get to the camp, they have to actually room with someone from the other race. They have to spend time talking to people from the other race and learning facts about them and their lives and their families. And they have to do that with every person from the other race, right? So you're, again, learning that diversity.
Yeah, and they do a number of different like vignettes at camp that sort of illustrate how it's progressing. So there is obviously a couple of montage scenes where they're kind of just showing how goofy this is. So my favorite scene in the whole movie is so dumb, but it's Ryan Gosling as Bosley just like dancing, like fake line dancing in place to the country music, which sounds awful.
Right.
And his who he's rooming with at the time is just like, oh my God, kill me now.
Right. Which would have also
it's good.
been
You like this? It's good.
Yeah, that would have been also my reaction had I been roomed with someone who listens to that music all the time.
Yeah. So, there's that, and then the locker room scene where they're just coming out with yo mama jokes,
right?
And then a song comes on and they all start singing it together. Oh, such brilliance in a Disney movie. Everyone's kumbayaing that time. Yeah. So they do a really good job of just like not showing one thing, but like multiple things. And it sort of grows as the movie goes, right? We get this growth of a relationship between Gary Bertier and Julius Campbell, who are at odds with each other at the beginning of the movie and just dislike each other to their cores, but have this really great moment in the middle of the movie. So not only do they show that in the camp where they're growing this understanding and respect, but they show it throughout the movie, I think, which is something that they could have like dropped if they really wanted to, right? They could just be teammates,
right?
But they end up like becoming brothers almost,
right. And to be fair to the writers at Disney, they do make an effort to address sexism with the daughters a little bit. That's
true.
They make a Disney nod to homophobia with Sunshine, so they try to just kind of make everybody like everybody by the end.
Yeah, so almost a colorblind perspective.
Which we know does not work.
Right, which we don't know does not work. Okay, so what is the third criterion of Allport's theory here?
The third criterion is kind of going back to the coaches, but it's also a bigger picture, which is that the authority figures and general environment have to be supportive of the groups coming together and ending their prejudice. So we see that struggle a little bit with the coaches, and they also have to grow. But we see that in the bigger picture with the parents and the town also having to kind of overcome their initial prejudice.
Right. And I think some specific things to point out regarding this is that, the coaches at the very beginning in camp are not fans, especially the assistant white coach. I can't remember his name, but he's just coming in and barging in like, what are you doing in Coach Yost's office? And what are you doing here? And it's like, I think Coach Yost can talk for himself, but okay, thanks, enforcer. And then when they get to the camp, these things slowly peel away. But then you come back to the town. they find out that the first time he loses, he's gone.
Right.
Because the school board is not a fan of the subterfuge to get Coach Boone head coach. And Kate Bosworth plays Gary Bertier's girlfriend, and it's like, I don't want to hang out with those people.
Right.
And just several instances of not just authorities, but others that are not supportive of this.
Right. We see this kind of poignantly with Bertier's mother saying, I don't want you to go play basketball, with Julius. And then kind of, again, coming around, and we see, the girlfriend refusing to shake his hand at the beginning and then going up and shaking his hand in the middle of the game, by the way, later. But
high school football, I guess.
Right. So, we do see that it has to be in a larger environment of acceptance. And even if you kind of wanted to end the prejudice against the outgroup, if the larger environment is still supportive of a prejudiced status quo, it makes it much harder.
Okay. So if the town never came around, let's say, they had a mediocre season, they did lose, but they didn't follow through with the firing on the first loss. Maybe they gave him a couple more chances to really show, but really the town was against it. So do you think then this, even if like Yost was like, yeah, let's do this, this is amazing, it wouldn't have much effect? Boone's gone.
I guess I don't know what would have happened in terms of like the coaching staff. I can conjecture that I think, coming from a relatively small town myself, when my high school basketball team like won the championship, the whole town really did kind of come together. So they're sports ball, and I'm not trying to, I'm not someone who's ever been athletic. So maybe it's just me, resentful of the fact that I have no athletic skill, but I've never been someone who like really was in the world of athletics or sports. But I see, from an outsider perspective, I see how that can bring people together and build a community. Okay.
All right. And so, the community has to be down with it for this to be successful. And if they're not, it's unlikely to be successful.
Right.
So what is the fourth criterion?
The fourth criterion is actually the most important in terms of Sharif's famous study. And I think in this movie. So just to give it the context of the research, when Sharif tried to bring his boys in his research study together, he tried just kind of simple contact, like, y'all are going to eat lunch in the cafeteria together and just let's see what happens. Well, it did not go well. They ended up calling each other names and like throwing chairs at each other. It was bad news. So in order to have them sort of recover from the prejudice that he had instilled in them, he had them work toward common goals, or what he called superordinate goals, which is that you can't actually achieve this goal unless you work together. The classic example of this is that there was a pickup truck that brought food into the camp every day, and he drove it into a ditch on purpose. And each side of the camp, each sort of cabin of real life boys, tried to like push and pull the truck out of the ditch. Now, when only one side did this at a time, the driver was actually in the truck pushing on the brake to make sure that they were not successful.
I know, this is so funny.
Right? It's like total manipulation. Yeah. Only when the two cabins decided we're going to try this together, then did magically the truck like get out of the ditch.
Yeah.
So he did this in a couple of various ways in the research, but this is super important in the movie because the argument from a research perspective is neither group could have had the successful football season that they had without relying on each other. And they make that explicit in a couple of ways, right? Like you need to block the people, of the opposite race who are on your same team. You can't just let them keep getting hit. So the fact that they had to achieve the football wins by working together is this common goal that we see.
Coach, can I speak with you in private?
Sure. What's on your mind, son?
I want Ray off the team, Coach.
You know my policy, Gary.
Yes, I do. And I respect it, but I know that Ray missed that block on purpose. Sometimes you just gotta cut a man loose.
Well, you're the captain. You make a decision, but you support your decision.
Ray?
You're out.
What?
I'm not gonna let you play for this team anymore.
Oh, yeah, Jerry Lewis? Gonna go and tell Coach Kuhn what to do just like last time? But then that's right. He is your daddy now, isn't he? Kuhn don't cut anybody. Remember, Gary?
I had you cut, Ray.
You willing to just throw away our friendship for them? You can keep them.
And to your point about, blocking people, that character Ray, who is told to block for the black players on offense, he ends up being this subversive agent within the team because he doesn't like what's going on.
Right.
And in the middle of the movie, and despite his subterfuge, they continue to win, and eventually Bertier, who is like the captain of the football team, but also like the leader, quote unquote, of the white boys on the team, he's like, Ray, you're off the team. You're doing this, and it eventually ended up, with their quarterback getting harmed, who was injured, who was black, and he's like, you didn't block for him. This is your fault. You're off the team.
Right. And that reflects what Sharif found as well, because really importantly, if you've had two groups separated by prejudice, not only do you have negative beliefs about the opposite group, but you tend to kind of maintain positive beliefs about your own group and defend people from your own group. And what Sharif found in the study was after the two cabins had come together, the boys in that real life study were not only willing to say some of my best friends are from the other cabin, but they were for the first time willing to say, I don't really like some of the guys in my own cabin. Some of them are jerks. And they were finally able to admit that. And we see that in the film with the character of Ray.
You're right. And so he's just like, no, you're now ostracized from here because you are trying to chill our vibe, man. Get out of here. And you mentioned a couple of other things here too. When they did the understanding and respect aspect of this, eventually instead of sitting as black players and white players, they started mingling with players on their own side of the ball, defense and offense, as you say. And so again, they stopped seeing race in a more colorblind way. I think that's really where this colorblind idea, that was really, from my understanding, this idea of colorblindness was really in vogue around this time, right? Like 90s into the early 2000s.
You're absolutely right. This idea that I'm just not going to see race. I'm just going to pretend racism isn't a thing. We're living in a post-racial society. It just, it doesn't work. It's disrespectful to people who you're basically erasing their entire heritage. It's not a good plan.
Lived experiences.
It's also just a lie. Like, people notice what race you are.
Yeah. You can't just escape it. And so we sort of wove through here the Robbers Cave stuff. So to give a little bit more background and a little bit of details that I like adding to when I tell the story to my students is, so like I said, this is Robbers Cave State Park in New Jersey. And Sharif and his colleagues brought a bunch of kids here, and it was 1959. It's the summer of like 1958 or something like that, where these boys came to do this. And You gotta love it because it's a snapshot in time. You mentioned that the boys called each other names. My favorite phrase in all of psychological research. They called each other cheats and sneaks. That was the actual question on the questionnaire. The ratings that they would get at these various stages that you were mentioning.
Yeah.
They were asked how many of the other boys on the other team, the other cabin, do you feel are cheats and sneaks? Because this was the 50s.
Yeah,
and these were white boys. They called each other cheats and sneaks, and it was a dagger to your heart.
My other favorite phrase from that particular study is when they describe the sort of elevating aggression between the two cabins, and it gets to the point where the boys were planning rocks in socks. So they're gonna put rocks in their socks and like whip them around and nail the other kids. That is not cool.
And like throwing them like maces.
Right.
But also like they didn't live here in these cabins. And so what if like you tossed one and it hit like a window or broke something? Like you're in for some trouble. And it's a good thing that, these camp counselors and these researchers stepped in and Zimbardoed it and was like, no, you're not doing this anymore.
Right. Zimbardo would just be watching from behind the pane of glass.
He probably would. Although
good stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Taking photographs. So, Wind, you had mentioned that the process that these boys went in for the Robbers Cave study. So they were brought to the state park and they stayed in these cabins. And one thing that some listeners might be familiar with is what they called themselves. So they gave them a task as a sort of separate team building exercise for that first stage, like get to know your group. And so they came up with really terrifying names. The Eagles, who, I got to say, bald eagles don't look that terrifying. Maybe if they were trying to, like, peck out my eyes, they'd be terrifying. But they, like, coo. They, like, coo at you.
Okay,
like,
you're just being anti-patriotic right now. The bald eagle, apparently. That's good stuff.
So one of the groups called themselves the Eagles, and they made a flag, and they were like, "This is our flag, damn it!" And then the other team was called the Rattlers. Also, by the way, how do these boys growing up in New Jersey know anything about rattlesnakes except for what they read in a book?
They're probably in the Boy Scouts or something, right?
Yeah, okay, I'll give you that one. Maybe they were. But they thought, what's going to strike fear into my enemy's heart? A rattler. A baby rattler.
They weren't thinking of baby rattles.
I know. I just think it's like you guys couldn't have like thought of Wolverine or Tiger or
okay, but
lion.
One of my favorite photos that they published in the original study was once they sort of started war on the other camps, they made new flags. And the Eagles painted a new flag of an eagle stepping on a rattlesnake, which would happen, awesome.
Right?
Right.
If this were a bird of prey and they were hungry, they would totally eat a snake.
Yeah.
I've seen videos of like ospreys like picking up a snake and just like midair, just like crunching their talons as they're flying away with their meal. Right?
Sure.
Because you got to kill that thing, otherwise it's going to bite you.
I'm not sure they thought out their cabin names in the same way that we would have liked them to.
Hey guys, I got some notes for you. Okay, hang on. So they do these stages. They do this first stage where they like team build. They do that second stage where you were saying that they were actively doing things in a competitive way. And then after this, like, I forgot how long they were actually there for, but after this period of a few days, they then ask them how many boys of the other team do you think are cheats and sneaks, and you can see the bar graph, and it's pretty high for both groups. I think one group is a little higher than the other. I forget how they explained the difference there, whether or not it was worth explaining and meaningful in any way. And they did, like you said, sport competitions. I think my favorite one is, since they have the flags, they actually played Capture the Flag.
Yeah.
Which is an old-timey sport that nobody ever plays anymore.
Well, the one that always strikes me is in the competition phase, they play tug of war.
And tug of war, yeah.
And that rope that they used in tug of war is the rope that they tied to the truck and used to pull it out of the ditch in the last phase.
Oh, I don't think I ever made that
So
connection.
It becomes this kind of like symbol of the fact that we are no longer enemies.
I like that. Little, yeah, quite symbolic.
Right.
Quite symbolic. And then, as you said, when this final stage where they come in and work on common goals, one of the common goals, so you mentioned the truck thing. I think that was probably one of their biggest challenges that they faced. But they also had smaller challenges, like make sure everybody in this room has a consensus of what film we're going to watch tonight.
And they had to pool their money to rent the actual like old school projector and film reels.
Yeah. Which, wouldn't be a thing now, right? The massive decision would be like, what movie are we watching? But like, they were like, you got to pool your money together to get the projector. You are watching a movie tonight. What is it going to be?
Right.
So there's that much effort. You got a lot of effort justification going on there too, in making that common goal good for the majority, at least, coming to a consensus. Maybe a few of them were like, I don't like watching movies, and I'll just sit in the back and I'll read or something like that. But it's still a common goal. It's a lot smaller when you compare it to getting this truck out of the ditch, but it is one nevertheless. And you can kind of go back to the movie and be like, who cares about football? And that's a valid question. Some people don't care about football. And they, since you mentioned your students are many times athletes, that is the case for me. I would use this movie if I had a lot of athletes in my class, especially a lot of football athletes who are like, sports movies about the sport that I like are some of my favorite.
Yeah.
Maybe that's the case. Maybe that's not the case. But at least this is a palatable sports movie.
I think.
But the question is, like, why is, winning a football season or a state championship the common goal here when it could be something far greater?
Well, and I think it's because of the Titans, right? Like, I mean,
sure, they
picked this football team that had been, very successful in Virginia at the time. So the football is the thing that they're trying to win, and it becomes symbolic, of course, of the lack of prejudice and the town coming together and all the things we talked about. But football is very Disney, right? It's something that the common person will be able to understand and relate to. Mm-hmm. And I think that's why my students kind of resonate with this movie. They often ask me at the end of the semester, why didn't we watch any Lifetime movies? So that's the kind of movie that they're looking for. They're not looking for, A Clockwork Orange.
Yeah, Lifetime movies. Hold on, let me just do a semester of Christmas Lifetime films for your enjoyment. Right. See if you can spot the similiarities.
Right. I'm not trying to bash Lifetime movies, but it's not what I use in my college class.
Right. The lowest common denominator. No. We're going to go a little bit higher than that.
Yeah.
So we're going to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and discuss the historical events versus what is shown in this Disney movie. Stay tuned. Howdy. Thanks for listening to this episode. We hope you're enjoying the conversation. Over the past 2 years, the podcast has grown, and that's mostly in part to folks like you, the listeners. We've also had wonderful luck receiving support from the Society for the Teaching of Psychology, APA Division II Small Partnerships Grant. It's been a fun ride, and we want to keep it going. So we need your help. There are several ways that you can support this show. You can share episodes with your social media networks so we can grab new listeners. You can join our fledgling Patreon program. You can contribute directly using PayPal, or you can purchase some sweet merchandise with our logo at our Spreadshirt merch store. All of those things can be found on the website cinemapsychpod.swanpsych.com. But perhaps the best thing that you can do is to keep listening and leave us feedback on Facebook or Twitter so we know you've listened. Thanks. And now back to the show. And we are back with Dr. Wynn Goodfriend talking about Remember the Titans, that Denzel Washington film you saw one time 20 years ago. It's a good one if you like Denzel Washington.
Who doesn't like Denzel Washington?
I would like to meet that person. Somebody's
too.
just going to tell me. Somebody's just going to tell me. They're like, I listened to that episode, and you told me to come and tell you that I don't like Denzel Washington.
That was
like, I don't want to know you anymore.
That's your
I
Karen
don't
voice right there.
Thank you. So it's a Disney movie, as we said, and it does play a lot with historical events. So a good thing to do if you really want to have this entire conversation in context is to really know what Disney and the filmmakers changed versus what actually happened. So this is based on a true story, which of course is just filmmaking for some parts are true, some parts are not. We're not going to tell you what isn't and what's not.
True.
And I think that's the worst kind of deception because they're not going to take any responsibility for what's not true versus what is true. They're just going to be like, you decide. Okay, all right, fine. So first things first, I think to set up this discussion, the setting of the time setting of the movie says 1971. It's the title card in the beginning of the movie. It says 1971. The other thing that it tells you is that the schools are being integrated. Well, in Alexandria, the schools were actually integrated 6 school years prior to that 1971 season of the Titans. So they played with that one immediately. They didn't even let the story progress at all, and they made a change just so they could get this 1971 story down for Herman Boone. So to make it all align. What are some of the other things, Wind?
Well, it's important to kind of mention a couple of the things that we mentioned earlier tonight, but I just want to bring them up again to clarify.
Sure.
One is that we discussed that in 1965, they had their racial integration. They also had 3 high schools coming together into one high school. And so there was some kind of consternation in the town, according to what I've been able to find. But the consternation was more like, okay, how are you going to fit into one building? It was sort of a size issue more than the racial integration issue. So,
Going to my school, boy. Man, this stuff is messed up.
Yeah, anything serious happened, they shut the school down and our season go down the drain. This here real messed up. But there are a lot of pretty women here.
Hey,
Look at them, Gary. They hate us.
just a bad day. Things will cool down.
No, Gary, they're always gonna hate us.
We don't need you here either, hippie boy. Did you hear what he said?
Hey, man.
Hey, Julius.
Man, it's crazy out here, man.
Yeah, well, what did you expect?
I don't know. I ain't quite expecting to be like this.
Sorry. Julius, this is Emma.
They make Alexandria seem more rural than I feel like it was or it is. I mean, I know it's more the quaint suburb of Washington, D.C., but the fact of the matter is it's a suburb of Washington, D.C.
I have also been to Alexandria many times because I have family there, and the the cosmopolitan feel of it, the fact that it's absolutely very racially diverse, is part of the characteristic of the town. So I do feel like they made it seem like small town Southern vibe, and that's not really what you get if you go to Alexandria.
Yeah, so I think that makes a lot of sense. It feels like farther south, and smaller town.
Right.
And neither of those things are true.
And the protests that they show in the movie just did not happen, period. So that's an important change.
The protests that they show when the school semester starts?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah, as if I know people protest schools. The pandemic has shown us a lot about what people are willing to do with their free time. So it doesn't strike me that they would. It doesn't strike me as I'm not surprised that they would.
And other schools have protests, as we know.
Sure.
Just not this one.
Not this particular one, not in 1965, and definitely not in 1971.
Right.
So let's jump to the camp, because there's some inaccuracies at the camp, right?
Right. So we mentioned earlier that they did do this, get off the bus and get back on the bus on the way to camp. They really did go to Gettysburg College the summer before the football season started. And so he really did do that kind of like mixing up the races at the beginning. But there's a very powerful scene in the film where he wakes them up at 3 a.m. and makes them run through the forest in their underwear, and they go to the cemetery and he makes a big speech. And that, again, is a modification of what really happened. So apparently they did visit Gettysburg, but it was like in the middle of the day, and they got a guided tour, and he didn't make them run there. So that was again playing with the facts.
Yeah, and I think the decision obviously was far more cinematic to have them run at 3 a.m. into the cemetery. But it sounds like real life when you say that they got a guided tour of Gettysburg.
Right.
Like, that sounds more like real life. Oh, okay. So sort of half-assed prejudice reduction. Okay, yeah, that sounds like real life.
Yeah, like if you go to Gettysburg, there are like historians who will tell you the real story.
Right. But you could listen to that or not listen to that because it's a museum tour. Obviously, the site of Gettysburg is important for what it was in the Civil War. But, you know, and Denzel Washington as Herman Boone makes some really great points.
It was a beautiful speech.
About racial prejudice. Exactly.
Anybody know what this place is? This is Gettysburg. This is where they fought the Battle of Gettysburg. 50,000 men died right here on this field, fighting the same fight that we're still fighting amongst ourselves today. This green field right here, painted red, bubbling with the blood of young boys. Smoke and hot lead pouring right through their bodies. Listen to their souls, man. I killed my brother with malice in my heart. Hatred destroyed my family. You listen. You take a lesson from the dead. If we don't come together right now on this hollow ground, we too will be destroyed. Just like they were. I don't care if you like each other or not, but you will respect each other. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we'll learn to play this game like men.
And it's just Nah, I sent the boys up to Gettysburg on the bus. They're gonna guided tour. This is great.
Right.
We're taking a break from camp. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also, learn some racial history while you're there, please.
I feel like that's what really happened.
Yeah. That is so real American life. It's not even funny.
Yeah.
What else?
There's another very powerful scene where Coach Boone is at home and they actually have Coach Yost's daughter kind of staying there, and someone throws a brick through the window. That also is based on something that really happened. And in this particular case, the real thing that happened was actually worse because someone threw an entire toilet through the window of their house.
Oh my gosh.
And Coach Boone, the real Coach Boone, has talked about like how horrible and humiliating it is to have someone throw a toilet through the front window of your house.
Yeah.
So that was interesting because from what I read, the sort of writers and producers in the movie said we're going to change it to a brick just because it's less horrifying. Yeah.
And there's that Disney aspect there, right?
Right.
Where we're like, let's make this more palatable rather than suggesting that you are only worth what this thing is for. Gotta say, one of the greatest inventions in the world, but still, it has other connotations.
Are you referring to toilets or brick?
Toilets.
No, I know. I was just kidding.
So, and we're just gonna change it to a brick because you can easily toss that through a window.
Right.
Pom pom. Yeah, that is a bummer.
It is an example of the kind of glossing over that I think that the movie does for these really deeply important issues.
Right. And one of those is, as you mentioned earlier, homophobia, right?
Right. So that's another good example. So there is a real person who is the character of Sunshine, who kind of comes from California. That's a real person. But he never...
Ronnie Bass.
Right. So he never... the real person said, like, I'm married to a woman. I've never, been gay or bisexual or pansexual. Nor did my teammates suspect that of me just because I was California. Like, that's just another stereotype. Also, in the movie, they make him cut his hair and people kind of make fun of him for being a California hippie, and he's doing Tai Chi and stuff. And he's like, none of that ever happened. I had pretty short hair, actually, and many of the people on the team had longer hair than I did. And so that whole hippie California thing was kind of made up.
Yeah, and it wasn't a rule that Boone had about, cutting hair and whatnot. There was no rule about that. The real Herman Boone was a real mean guy, but he wasn't, as hyper-focused on, like, you will act this way.
Right, like military stuff.
Right, like Captain Hoyt in Brooklyn Nine-Nine. Like, he's not saying you have to wear a tie if you're in my precinct.
Right.
You have to cut your hair, yeah. And to be fair, I didn't remember how long it was to how short it gets when they cut it.
Yep.
They barely cut it in the movie, too. Like, I would still consider that hair long.
I know. I thought, that he was going to get a buzz cut.
Yeah, I thought that's what when I first saw it, I thought, oh yeah, they're gonna cut that whole thing. Oh,
yeah,
it's so silly, so silly. So, one of the major sort of subplot points for the movie is that Bill Yost is kind of put in a position of undermining his own team. Right, he's still a coach. He's still competitive. He still wants to win, but he also has his own ambitions, and some of those ambitions are set up in the movie. And the one of the members of the school board or something like that comes to him and says, your team loses. We get rid of Boone. You get reinstated as head coach. You go immediately into the high school Hall of Fame.
Right.
And
there was going to be a vote on whether Yost got into the Virginia High School Football Hall of Fame.
Yeah, and because he doesn't ultimately throw the game, they're like, no, none for you now, Sonny. Which, gotta tell you, he could take those people to court for that. I'm sure some jury would be like, that he said. It's pretty compelling.
Yeah.
But in any case, what was inaccurate about that?
At the time that this movie was taking place, 1971, there is no such thing as the Virginia High School Football Hall of Fame. That is not a thing. It became a thing later, but
They probably saw this movie.
Right. They were like, that's a good idea. But not at the time.
So completely made up, fictionalized thing for no reason other than to sow immediate conflict that can be immediately resolved, as you have to do in movies that aren't going to get a sequel or, a franchise or whatever.
It did build a lot of drama and show, the inner conflict of willing to make a sacrifice for the greater good kind of thing. So
right.
In terms of the writers, again, I give the writers of this props for like very, very emotionally heartfelt stuff.
Yeah, I will give them credit for that. It would be nice, is all I'm saying, that if it was just grounded in stuff that wasn't anachronistic.
Yeah.
So that's my only complaint.
I agree.
Let's talk about Gary Bertier for a second. So he is, like I said, so he's played by Ryan Hurst. I don't know if I said that. Ryan Hurst has been active for the last 20 years in a bunch of stuff. You may have seen him someplace recently, but he plays Gary Bertier, who's a real person, who is sort of the captain of the team, and he helps bring some people to the table, and he obviously shoves people away from the table, as I mentioned with Ray, to really get this group going. And he was a real person, but they play with his history a little bit. I think a little bit too much for the previously mentioned heartfelt / heart-wrenching scenes. So what was real and what was fake about Gary Bertier?
Well, they portray him as getting in a car accident that leads him to be paralyzed and in a wheelchair.
Mm-hmm.
That car accident did happen.
Mm-hmm.
He really was paralyzed. He really did go into a wheelchair, and he really did later go on to be in what was called the Wheelchair Olympics. I'm not sure if that's
in the time
different from the Special Olympics or an earlier version.
It's now the Paralympic Games.
Yeah, okay. So he really did do that, and he really did win the gold medal for shot put.
Yeah.
The part that they played with to really build drama in the film was the time that accident happened was a couple of months after the end of the season. Mm-hmm. So it had no effect on the plot point of the film. He wasn't, watching the championship game from his hospital room or any of that kind of thing. They didn't say, let's win this one for Gary or anything like that.
Right. So yeah, that plays into the whole like, let's create some tension where it never existed in the first place. And so for the viewer of the movie, they're like, oh man, poor Gary.
Right.
They better win this state championship for him. When in all actuality, Gary Bertier played that state championship and won it, just like every one of the other players did.
Absolutely.
And then he had a car accident, and then he got really good at shot put.
Right.
And then he won a gold medal.
Right.
So
and he did die several years later, like in the end of the film.
Yeah. So they show the at the beginning of the film starts with the walk toward the funeral site at the cemetery, and then they say that was 10 years into the future, and that's when Gary Bertier does actually die in 1981. So it is 10 years later. So at least they get that one right. And so he dies in 1981, tragically, in a car accident.
Right.
So there is some tragic poetry to this particular person's life, and they show that with great effect in the movie. They just mess with the timing, and I think that's a bit disingenuous for the viewer. That's one of those moments that I'm just like, I think you could have created that moment either in another way. So not, so this sort of violence porn that we all need to see in these movies. Like, we don't need to be like, oh, poor Gary, to be like, come on, Titans, you can do it. Because they've already set up other parts of this, but they needed it for the players. And I don't think that they needed to mess with that time. To me, that's disingenuous to a viewer who's not going to go look up the trivia and be like, oh, that wasn't real. That they read the title cards and they're like, he died 10 years later. Okay, I mean, that seems like it's plausible.
And the way that they set up the very end of the movie with the like black and white photographs of the people and what they went on to do, it makes it seem like this is all a true story. Right.
Yeah. And highlighting the real people in the who had good amount of lines to them, not like Ryan Gosling's character who didn't have that many lines, but like
was not
Herman Boone, Bill Yost, Gary Bertier.
I don't think Ryan Gosling's character was a real person.
You don't think he was a real person?
I mean, even
there you go, exactly. So like Herman Boone, Bill Yost, Gary Bertier, and Julius Campbell.
Yep.
You feel for these people, and they talk about them at the end, and they're like, this is what happened in their lives, and that's not real. So that's my major gripe about some of these movies, and particularly Disney movies that are based on true stories, because they are fairly consistent at messing with historical accuracy.
True.
They're probably the worst offenders at it, for pretty much everything. But for this one thing, I didn't like that when I read it. I didn't like that. I think they could have done that a little bit better. But then again, humans do look at a car accident and go, "Ooh, yikes! I hope they're okay."
And the car accident was real.
The car accident was real, just not when it occurred.
Right.
And that's my biggest complaint. What was one more thing that they didn't get right?
The last thing I'll say is that they portray the team doing various things that were made up. So one is that they portrayed a couple of the games in the film as being like super close, and it came down to like the last play. That was completely not real. The Titans pretty much destroyed every other team the entire season.
Yeah.
It's a fun Disney thing to see them like dancing for their warm-ups. That was totally made up. They did not dance for their warm-ups. And then the last thing that's relevant to our conversation today is that in the beginning of the movie, they say that, the Titans were the only racially integrated team in their conference, and that all the other teams were 100% white players.
Yeah. And they show that in the movie when we see their opponents. Yeah.
Right. And that's just absolutely not true. Every high school in the conference was racially integrated.
And if you think about it, this is, 15 plus years after Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. So we're talking about, states were having to deal with their own integration issues after that decision came down. But you're talking 15 plus years. And I know there are some there. I know that there are plenty of places in the Deep South that resisted it for as long as they could, which, ultimately led to the civil rights movements and all that stuff. But that was also in the 60s. And this film was set in 1971. And so this, again, is Disney setting up a sort of partially false narrative that it was this bad in 1971. And now in 2000, when this movie's coming out, look how bad it used to be. Look how terrible it is. Now look at your life. Is it that bad still? And the answer I think a lot of people could say is, yeah, it's still kind of like that.
Yeah.
So I felt dismayed again. First time watching this movie with the kind of lens that I've been watching movies with doing this podcast, a very critical lens, and not really holding any prisoners for whether or not a film is good as it was. Like, the question that a lot of people ask is, does it hold up? Of course, they're usually asking that question from a, like, I don't know, special effects perspective. But really, the question you could ask you could ask of Remember the Titans is, does it hold up? And I don't think it does from a racial perspective.
Yeah, and I feel like we have this conversation a lot when I'm on your show, because we had this conversation with Rocky Horror, right? And my students hated that film and they loved this film. So I will say that I see a lot of issues with this film. I don't like several of the things that they changed. Just to kind of, play devil's advocate here. I think the reason my students love this film is because it, in some ways, inspires them to see the good that the world could be, right? And so if watching this film makes you want to, embrace people that society has told you shouldn't embrace, if this film makes you be optimistic about the future, those aren't necessarily bad things.
No, I agree. They aren't bad things to not have. I suppose I'm more cynical these days. So maybe I shouldn't watch feel-good movies now because I'm just too cynical.
You should watch movies like Joker.
Yes, right? Watch movies like Joker, or watch movies like The Machinist or American Psycho.
Right.
Yeah, those feel-good movies, right?
Yeah. I'll come back next time and we'll talk about something that's super depressing and terrible.
Since that's what we're actually good at. Although we did talk about Elf that one time.
We did talk about Elf.
Yeah. So it's been a roller coaster. I want to thank you, Wind, again for stopping by to discuss Remember the Titans. And so before we say goodbye, I would like to ask, what have you been up to recently?
Well, in honor of Black History Month, which is why we chose this film for February, I'm really proud of a project that I've been working on. It's a book that will be coming out in early 2023, published by Taylor and Francis. And it's called Early Psychological Research Contributions from Women of Color. Mm-hmm. And every chapter features a dissertation project from a woman of color who earned her Ph.D. in the United States. And some of them, are more recent than others. My chapter, I have two co-authors. And so our chapter is on Mamie Phipps Clark. And she ties into our conversation tonight because her master's thesis actually was the famous doll studies that people can look up if they're interested. And it was the first time psychology research was ever used as evidence in a Supreme Court case. And that Supreme Court case was Brown versus Board of Education.
Exactly. It's such an amazing twixt of psychological history here to be so deeply ingrained in one of the things that reshaped the United States a lot. And its decision was to integrate schools, and I think that's awesome. So congratulations on that one. Sucks that you have to wait until like a full year for it to come out. But let me ask you this: so it's a chapter. It's an edited chapter like volume, right? So several chapters from different author groups.
Absolutely, and several women of different ethnicities.
As authors or the subjects of the papers?
Both.
Okay. But it's not just a book on Mamie Phipps Clark, right? It's other
Mamie Phipps Clark is just one chapter. Every chapter features a different woman of color.
Oh, that's amazing. Okay. And these women of color are psychology researchers.
They're all psychology dissertations.
Okay.
And so they're landmark sort of pioneers in terms of the impact that they've had on the.
That's wonderful. I think everyone should take a look at that when it comes out. I'm sure that'll be discussed. Please share it on the FB page when it does come out. Wind, I know this isn't going to be your last time, so it's a see you later moment here. But I want to thank you for joining me again.
Thank you so much for inviting me back. I always have so much fun.
These are great. And listeners, until the next episode, thanks for listening.